Okay, here is the second part of chapter 12 on the heart. We're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. And one cardiac cycle is one cycle of contraction and relaxation in the heart. Contraction is systole. Relaxation is diastole. So during diastole, the chambers of the heart, the ventricles specifically, are relaxing. And during systole, the ventricles are contracting. So here's one cardiac cycle: relaxation, contraction. And then that starts all over again: contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. This happens over and over and over again. And this is also, the phases of the cardiac cycle are broken down into kind of subcategories. You've got complete relaxation. This is diastole in the heart. The atria contract and pump blood to the ventricles, while the ventricles are in diastole. So this is atrial systole, but still ventricular diastole. And then when the atria are finished contracting and pumping blood to the ventricles contract in ventricular systole and pump blood out through the big vessels, pulmonary trunk and aorta, while the atria relax. And then that starts all over again. So both atria contract first. That's atrial systole. That happens during ventricular diastole. Then both ventricles contract. During ventricular systole, the atria are undergoing diastole, relaxation. The cardiac cycle begins when all chambers are relaxed, the ventricles are partially filled with blood. To completely fill the ventricles with blood, the atria contract. So atrial systole occurs, filling the ventricles. When atrial diastole will continue until the start of the next cardiac cycle, during that time, ventricular systole begins. And there are two phases. Ventricular systole occurs in the first phase, where the atrioventricular valves push closed by way of the beginning of ventricular contraction, but the semilunar valves remain closed because ventricular contraction hasn't increased pressure in the ventricle high enough to push open the semilunar valves. And that phase is called isovolumetric, the same volume contraction. So during isovolumetric contraction, the ventricles are contracting, but the amount of blood in the chamber is not changing because all sets of valves are closed. When the ventricles contract forcefully enough, they open the semilunar valves, and the second phase of ventricular systole occurs, which is called ventricular ejection. Ventricular diastole occurs when pressures, as the ventricles start to relax, pressure drops in the ventricles and blood flows back against the semilunar valves and closes the cusps. So another isovolumetric phase occurs, but now the ventricles are relaxing as opposed to contracting, and all sets of valves are closed, both semilunar valves and atrioventricular valves. As blood flows into the atria during this time, the AV valves are still closed, but eventually the ventricles relax enough to drop pressure and open the AV valves, and all the chambers are relaxed. And during late diastole, filling occurs in the ventricles again. So it all starts from the beginning. So take a look here. Right here is where the cardiac cycle begins. The atria contract while the ventricles are relaxed in diastole. And then the first phase of ventricular systole occurs, isovolumetric contraction. Look, the AV valves are closed and semilunar valves are closed. Then the ventricles contract enough to force open the semilunar valves, and you get ventricular ejection. Once that occurs, blood is pumped out of the heart, and the pressure in the ventricle begins to drop as ventricular diastole begins. So at the beginning of ventricular diastole, there is isovolumetric relaxation. So the ventricles are relaxing, but all valves are closed. Isovolumetric, the amount of blood in the chamber is not changing. And then we begin again from late diastole, when the AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed, and the cardiac cycle starts all over again. For all of that to happen, there is what's called a cardiac conducting or conduction system. Cardiomyocytes are demonstrate a property called automaticity. It is the ability of these muscle cells to contract on their own without help from a nerve or a hormone. And there are specific structures, neural-like structures, neural-like cells in the heart that are still cardiomyocytes, but they serve to control contraction and relaxation in the heart. And they're components of the cardiac conducting system. One's called the sinoatrial node. It's also the pacemaker. So if you've ever heard of like the pacemaker of the heart or the SA node, that is a special set of cells in the posterior wall of the right atrium that basically fires an action potential, generates an action potential, and sends it through the wall of the atrium and then down into the ventricles to the AV node, which is another bundle of automatics or autorhythmic cells at the junction between the atria and the ventricles. So there's these 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all structures of the cardiac conduction system that send action, that conduct action potentials through the muscle wall of the heart to coordinate and tell those muscle cells to contract and relax. So take a look at it here. So here's the SA node, sinoatrial node. There's the pacemaker. It sets the pace for your heart rate. So if your heart rate, resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute or 70 beats per minute, this sinoatrial node generates an action potential spontaneously 60 or 70 times per minute. And that action potential propagates, conducts through the walls of the atria to the AV node, atrioventricular node, down through the bundle, AV bundle, that splits branches to the right and the left bundle branch, and then out in the outer walls of the ventricles to Purkinje fibers. These are all neural-like muscle cells that coordinate the conduction of the electrical signal, the action potential, through the walls of the heart so that the atria contract first, then the ventricles. So the heart can contract and relax all on its own, but there are nerves from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems that innervates, send signals to the sinoatrial node. And the muscle cells in the heart. And from an area in the medulla oblongata, there is the integration center in the medulla. And there's two centers there, the cardio-inhibitory area and the cardio-acceleratory area. The cardio-inhibitory area basically has parasympathetic neurons that control and innervate the sinoatrial node, the AV node, and musculature in the atrium that slows down heart rate. The cardio-acceleratory area innervates all of the conducting system and all myocardium to increase heart rate, but also force of contraction. So look at this innervation. So from the medulla oblongata in the cardio-acceleratory area, neurons make their way all the way to the SA node and the wall of the atria. The yellow are the parasympathetic neurons. The more orange are sympathetic neurons that innervate all over the heart. Look at this innervation here. This is so cool. And these cells, these nervous systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, don't tell the heart to do its job. That's the SA node. The sinoatrial node is the pacemaker. It sets the pace. But this sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation can speed up heart rate or slow it down. So there's a rate that the SA node will fire at. It's about 100 times per minute. But the parasympathetic nervous system slows resting heart rate down to about 60 or 70 beats per minute. And the sympathetic nervous system can increase heart rate above that 100 beats per minute. So the SA node will work on its own. It doesn't need these nerves to do its job, but these nerves can speed up or slow down how fast the SA node works. Resting heart rates are about 60 to 100 beats per minute in a healthy person, and that varies quite a bit. The more physically and cardiovascularly fit you are, likely the lower your resting heart rate actually is. But a heart rate that's too slow, slower than normal, is considered bradycardia, and a heart rate that's too fast, faster than normal, is tachycardia. And we can measure those rates on an electrocardiogram or an ECG or an EKG. ECG and EKG are just two different spellings for the same word. They mean the same thing. And that basically is used to assess conduction function in the heart and can actually reveal damage to the cardiac conduction system from a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. So take a look at the electrocardiogram. There's 3 major phases that we can see on the EKG. The P wave is just named the P wave. It actually represents a time period where the atria are depolarizing. So when the SA node fires an action potential, what happens next, that action potential spreads through the atria. So you have a wave of depolarization that's represented on this EKG tracing as the P wave. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. It's much larger than the P wave because the ventricles are just a larger amount of tissue. During this time, the atria are repolarizing. Remember, as potassium leaves a cell, repolarization occurs. So during depolarization, sodium's rushing into the cell. During repolarization, potassium's leaving. So these events are just collectively shown on an EKG tracing as these waves or complexes. So ventricular depolarization and atrial repolarization are occurring during the QRS complex, or represented as the QRS complex. Atrial repolarization isn't actually seen or observed, recorded on the EKG tracing, because the QRS complex is such a massive event that it masks atrial repolarization. So you actually can't point out the period here or the time where atria are repolarizing. It's happening during the QRS complex, which is shown on here, but it represents ventricular depolarization. And then the T wave, where's my cursor? Here, the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So that's the time period when the ventricles are repolarizing, and that allows them to relax. So if the atria are depolarizing, depolarization in the atria stimulates muscle contraction in the atria. Ventricular depolarization stimulates muscle contraction in the ventricles, and then repolarization allows the ventricles to relax. Cardiac output, it's a rate. It is defined as the amount of blood pumped by the left ventricle, pumped out of the heart from the left ventricle in every minute of time. So milliliters per minute. And that depends upon how many times the heart beats per minute. So how many times does the ventricle contract every minute? So that's how fast it's working. But also another characteristic called stroke volume. And that's the amount of blood pumped out of the ventricle during one contraction. So how much blood is being pumped by the left ventricle? And we always use the left ventricle because it has a much bigger job and it pumps more blood to everywhere in the body as opposed to just the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle pumps blood to the systemic circuit. And the amount of blood pumped out of that ventricle can be calculated by multiplying heart rate times stroke volume. So if you multiply those two values together, heart rate and stroke volume, you get how fast the heart's working or how fast the heart is beating times how much blood it pumps out with every beat, and you get cardiac output. So heart rate times stroke volume is equal to cardiac output, how much blood is pumped out of the heart every minute. And think about it, if you increase heart rate, you increase cardiac output. Or if you increase stroke volume, you increase cardiac output. So during rest, cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute or so, 5 to 6 liters per minute. But during exercise, look at how much cardiac output can increase, because heart rate and stroke volume can go up so much. You can pump out 25 liters per minute of blood out of just the left ventricle, this little tiny chamber, and all the way up to 40 in maximally trained athletes. Your heart has an enormous capacity to increase blood flow as oxygen is needed. And factors that can increase heart rate is obviously sympathetic stimulation to increase heart rate, or parasympathetic to decrease heart rate. All of that increases or decreases cardiac output. Body temperature can increase heart rate, increases and decreases alike. And epinephrine and norepinephrine, thyroid hormones, the thyroxine and triiodothyronine, can increase heart rate. They have receptors for those hormones on the heart, and that can influence heart rate. All right, so that is part 2 of chapter 12. I will see you in the last section.